They sent the first letter on a Tuesday, 3 pages of rules, a bill for a fine, and a smiley sticker stuck to the corner like they thought it would soften the blow. I remember standing on my front porch, the late light hitting the old wooden railing my grandfather built, and feeling something in my chest go very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes before you have to decide whether to be small or to be someone who remembers who they are. My name is Eli Mercer, and that porch has been mine longer than I've been alive, which is to say, I could feel the history of it in the calluses on my palms. They wanted me to take a measuring tape to my flower boxes because according to a 3-inch rule in a document no one had ever mentioned, my hydrangeas were non-compliant. That was the beginning. We live in Red Oak, Comanche, neat cluster of houses, white fences, and a community gazebo people post pictures of when the light hits in the right way. It's pretty, and it pretends, and that's the problem. The HOA here is run like a country club board that never grew past its high school clique. Marjorie Hale is the president. She has a laugh like a thrift store charm and a cupboard full of influence. She knows the right people at the bank, and she knows how to make pain look bureaucratic. Her husband owns the landscaping company that conveniently shows up the morning after a grievance is filed. I didn't hate her at first. I thought she was someone who liked rules. I learned she liked power more. When the fines started small at first, they felt like a nuisance. When the notices increased, and then a crew showed up at dawn to trim for community standards and left my heirloom rosebush dead, it stopped being nuisance and became something else, a campaign. I could name the exact moment it got personal. It was a Saturday, neighborhood barbecue day, and Marjorie walked up with a printed complaint and announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Eli thinks the rules don't apply to him." She smiled as if she'd delivered a joke. That's when my neighbors stopped laughing. I'll tell you a secret about anger. It's useful when it's focused. I had paperwork my grandfather used to keep a faded deed, a yellowed map tucked behind a false page, and an old notebook, little things that meant more than ink. I started cross-referencing county records, calling people I'd barely known because my family had always paid attention to the small things. You'd be surprised how often "we never knew" becomes, "oh, that's inconvenient," when the paper trail runs the other way. I filed an appeal. I sent emails. I recorded conversations at board meetings legally, in a state that allows one-party recording because I'd seen the way the story changed when the lights went out. There were nights I lay awake hearing Marjorie's voice in my head, polite, precise, the kind of voice that makes accusations sound like weather forecasts. Community harmony, she'd say. Standards, she'd say. But the people who said those words were the ones who were happiest when others were quiet. The more I pushed, the more they retaliated. Fines turned into threats of liens, and liens turned into a notice about a proposed easement at the very edge of my property ground that had belonged to my family for decades. They painted it as a safety improvement. We all know what safety improvement looks like when the people proposing it own the contractor. It didn't feel like a David and Goliath story because David sometimes forgets his sling. It felt like waking up in a place that was trying to convince you it wasn't home anymore. So my response had to be methodical and weirdly tender. I documented everything: dates, times, names, photographs that showed a flower bed before and after the trim, audio of Marjorie praising a board member for being decisive. I found a neighbor, June, who kept a ledger of complaints in a notebook with coffee stains. She'd watched Marjorie escalate things subtly over the years, and finally, with a little prodding, she let me borrow that notebook. An ally is a neighbor who remembers the worst and still shows up to help you fix it. We held our own little hearings, informal, stubborn. I would stand by the gazebo and talk to whoever would listen. No one likes to be the first to stand up. It's the loneliest part. But people notice the pattern when you lay it out line by line. Grievance, contractor, dead plants, more grievance. People saw the same smiling face at both ends of the transaction. And suddenly the gazebo photos were shared with captions that said things like, "Is this fair?" The story spread because it was simple and it was true. I won't pretend it was clean. There was fear. There were cold calls at 2 in the morning, anonymous, designed to unnerve. Someone keyed my truck, and I found slashed tires one morning in my driveway. I remember kneeling in the gravel and thinking about a time my grandfather taught me how to sit with a problem until it cooled enough to handle. Anger is heat. Strategy is patience. We filed for a preliminary injunction to stop any further community improvement until the courts could look at the deeds. We gave the board no theater to perform in. It was a painfully slow, painfully satisfying process. There were cinematic moments because life, when you stare at it, hands you scenes. The night the grounds crew cut down the ancient maple by my fence, I turned on my porch light and saw Marjorie across the street, talking animatedly to a TV reporter about necessary safety measures. I walked up, the boards creaking under my weight, and said, "That tree was 50 years old. You took it down." She looked at me like I was a child complaining about a skinned knee and said, "We acted for the safety of the community." I said, "It had been safe for 50 years. She lowered her voice and said, with that practiced gentleness, "You make this personal." I smiled in return, not because I wasn't furious, but because she had just revealed her motive. At the hearing, everything that had been collected, photos, ledgers, recordings, suddenly mattered in a way it hadn't when it was just files in a folder. The judge listened, more patient than I deserved. The lawyer opposite us smiled a lot. That smile is a weapon. But the ledger, the photographs, the neighbor testimonies, they build a kind of quiet gravity. The judge issued a temporary restraining order on the easement, and for a week I felt the kind of relief you get after a fever breaks. But relief isn't an ending, it's a breath. Marjorie didn't go quietly into that breath. She ran an op-ed in the community newsletter painting me as a troublemaker, a person refusing to comply. She suggested the entire neighborhood would suffer because of one person's stubbornness. That's how these things escalate. They shift blame. They make you the problem so no one looks at the structure that produced the problem. So I did something slightly ridiculous. I organized a potluck. "Bring evidence," I told everyone with a grin. It was half joke, half proclamation. People brought photos, emails printed on paper, neighbors who remembered the old fence line, and the man who once mowed our shared lot. We ate casserole and laid the truth across paper plates. It's important to say this. Justice in small towns or small communities does not look like lightning bolts. It looks like people showing up, one by one, to say they remember a different version of events. It looks like a clerk at the county office who finally pulls a stack of scanned maps and says, "Huh, that's interesting." It looks like the grounds contractor getting a call and saying, "We changed plans," because his margin is smaller than his appetite for steady work. It looks like neighbors voting at an emergency meeting to revise the bylaws. It looks like Marjorie's allies quietly stepping back when the optics get worse than the benefits. When the board held its public meeting to discuss my case, there was a strange, electric hush. People who had been polite enough to avoid conflict for years were suddenly soft with grief and anger. A retired teacher told the room about my grandfather and the way he used to host schoolchildren on that porch. A young mother said she had photographed my garden for years because it reminded her of something good. There were tears, surprising, honest. Marjorie rose, precise as ever, and accused me of theatrics, of playing to the gallery. I stood up, and I did something I had rehearsed only in my head. I told the story of the porch, the hydrangeas, the maple, the ledger, the night my tires were slashed, the smell of sawdust when the tree was cut. I didn't shout. I told it like someone recounting a memory, because that's what it was, mine. The board voted to rescind the fines and to rescind the proposed easement. They voted to open an independent review of board practices. I remember the sound of the gavel, like someone closing a book you thought you'd lost. Victory, in that moment, tasted like old wood and spilled coffee. But it wasn't a clean ending, and I didn't want it to be. There are always consequences. Marjorie moved away a few weeks later and left a note that read like a resignation and a threat in equal measure. People stopped being friends the way some people can't unbake a cake. Power shifts feel messy because people are complicated. Now when I sit on that porch, the railing still creaks in the same place. The hydrangeas came back after a summer, and we planted a sapling where the maple had been, because you don't always get the old tree back, but you can plant something that will stand for something else. I learned there are limits to what paperwork can protect and more limits to what courage can endure. I learned that documentation matters, that neighbors can be allies, and that the stories we tell about our place in the world are stronger than a sticker on an envelope. So here's my ask, because that's what this kind of thing becomes when you tell it aloud. Tell me what you would have done. Have you ever been in a fight where the rules were the weapon? Do you think community rules should be enforced with compassion or with the iron hand? Drop a comment, tell your story, and tell me how you reckon with people who mistake rules for righteousness. If you like this, share it with someone who lives under a lawn sign that says community first. And if you want more, subscribe because I'll keep telling these stories, not because I like drama, but because none of us are owed silence when the things we love are at stake.